Over the centuries, as we said, the wheat's undergone significant domestication and breeding in order to improve the yield, to improve disease resistance, and other desirable traits like having higher gluten content. I think the bread that they consumed was different back then than our modern bread. As I said, grains had less gluten, and it was likely made using a fermentation process. But I also think, we're going to dive more into this, our environmental exposures are different today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Labels podcast with Farmer Joel Salatin. That would be me, and my partner in crime, Dr. Sina McCullough, the world's best researcher, who, by the way, has made quite a splash in recent days about the no grain. And today we're going to tackle probably one of the most difficult topics we've dealt with, because, I admit, man, I love bread. But I always say I love bread, but bread doesn't love me. And I think that speaks a little bit to what we're after here. And you go back, ancient civilizations. We just had on Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, who is also, the most questionable food you can eat is grains, seeds. And so there's this, do we really want a world without a bakery? It's the bakery, everything from, donuts to, muffins and whatever are such a part of our routine in our lives. Crackers and Triscuits and all this stuff. You can't go to a church potluck. You can't go to a Super Bowl party, without tons of all this wheat-based, grain-based stuff. So anyway, it's very difficult, and I can tell you that that I certainly share. I think Sina does too. We both share the angst. This is not a fun topic. Who doesn't like a big old fluffy loaf of donut? All right. And so we understand, we feel the pushback on this topic, but we've received enough questions and interest about it that it's time to tackle it. And Sina now admits, I've been putting this off for 2 years. It's time to tackle it. So let's tackle it, and we're going to do it. We're going to do it with empathy and hopefully some humor. We're not trying to establish a cult. We're not trying to throw a guilt complex on people. We're simply trying to help us all feel better and live better. And that's our idea. And so with that intro, Sina, jump us into this topic.
Thanks, Joel. Yes. Okay. We have a lot to cover today. And I want to reiterate that what Joel said, we're just trying to help people who are asking questions and maybe trying to improve their health situation. And I am not against grains. Okay. So I don't want that to come off as I'm this anti-grain person. I am not. I'm going to be sharing with you what I have found in my own research, what's in the scientific literature, what we're seeing in clinics across the world in terms of how best to reverse disease, and what I've seen with my own clients. Okay, but I'm not anti-grain. Okay, so there's a lot of questions and comments that we've received about grains in general, and particularly lately after Joel's podcast about talking about inventions and how wheat became so ubiquitous in the food supply. So I'm not going to read every single email that we received. We've condensed them down into 5 main questions. All right. So today we're going to be talking about one of the questions that we received is, why am I qualified to speak about grains? Number 2 is, bread is the body of Christ, so how could that be bad? Number 3 is, can you tell me more about how grains can cause disease? I think my child or myself or my, whoever it is, depending on the email, might have issues with grains, but the doctors keep saying we don't. Number 4 is, I eat bread all the time and I don't have any issues. So why can some people eat bread and have no issues and some people get really sick? And the fifth is, how do I actually know if I do have a problem with grain? All right, so we're gonna try to get through all of that, okay? Okay, first question, why am I qualified to speak on this matter? All right, so I have a PhD in nutritional biology, which means I'm an expert in how food affects the body in relation to both health and disease formation. I'm also a certified gluten-free society practitioner, which means I've demonstrated proficient knowledge in the subject of grains and all gluten-related disorders and conditions. And I'm an expert in reversing chronic and autoimmune diseases. Okay, and as I said, what I'm sharing today is based on my education, my research, peer-reviewed studies, personal experience, and clinical outcomes from around the world. I'm the first to admit there is a lot we do not know about gluten and grains. All right. Now, I can speak about this topic. We can have a whole month podcast on gluten and grains because there's so much information we do know. But we're going to just condense it down to important takeaway messages. Okay. And keep in mind, as I said, there's a lot we don't know. I'm sharing what we do know. Question 2, how can wheat be bad when Jesus told us to eat bread? All right. He said, take, eat, this is my body. All right. He said that to his disciples. So this is something that I have also grappled with, right, in my healing journey when I found out I wasn't able to digest grains properly. Now, I am not a biblical scholar. I am a scientific researcher. And what I have discovered in my research is that there is controversy around what the bread was actually like during the time of Jesus and how it was prepared. Now, I did not live during that time, of course, so I cannot tell you, nor can anybody tell you with 100% certainty what they were actually eating. But in my research, what I have found is that there seems to be some consensus that the bread during the time of Jesus was different from the bread commonly eaten today in modern times. The exact composition and characteristics of that bread could vary depending on the region, the culture, and the socioeconomic status of the people. So we think that during Jesus's time, the methods of cultivating, milling, and baking were all different from the current industrialized processes we use today. So for instance, the ingredients were probably different. Well, we know they didn't have the chemical ingredients, right, that we add to our bread today. But the bread during Jesus's time was typically made from whole grains like wheat, barley, or millet. And the ancient wheat was typically included varieties like emmer, einkorn, and spelt. They were not entirely gluten-free, but their gluten content was typically lower than what we have today. Okay, they had different properties than the gluten that we find in modern wheat. And you spoke to this too, that the gluten content actually increased over time. We've actually hybridized some wheat varieties to make them have a higher gluten content because gluten is what makes the bread fluffy and people like their fluffy breads, right? So we have changed some of this. Now, whether or not we've changed the ancient grains, that's controversial as well. But we do know that even those ancient grains had less gluten in them than what we have today. And unlike today's refined flours, the grains were generally ground into a coarser flour, which retained more of the bran and the germ, which provided additional nutrients, as well as a different texture. Today, in the industrial process, we don't have those added nutrients. Go ahead, Joel, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you've ever been to Germany and eaten what's called heavy German bread, I mean, it's full of black speckles. It's heavy. I mean, a loaf that a loaf the size of Wonder Bread. if you got Wonder Bread in the supermarket, a loaf that size of what we know as heavy German bread would weigh like, I don't know, 2 pounds. I mean, it's really, really heavy. And so I think it's important to realize exactly what you're saying, Cena, that in the ancient days, they didn't have bread was not Wonder Bread. Bread was not Dunkin' Donuts glazed donuts. We're all about space in the bread. They were all about density in the bread, partly because it traveled. You could take it with you when you traveled, and you didn't want to take a bunch of volume. You wanted to condense that volume in a small space. The other thing, let me just say, and again, I'm not a biblical scholar either, although I have done a lot of biblical study. And let me just say, one of the beauties of that of the communion table, when Jesus picked bread, um, at that time, bread was very special. Bread was very expensive. Grain was hard to get. Grain was hard to grow. It was extremely expensive. I don't think I would be blasphemous to say that perhaps if that were done today in modern American culture, the communion table would have been filet mignon. What I'm suggesting is that although bread was known throughout the culture, it was a luxury item. It was not consumed with like it was not as ubiquitous as it is for us today. And so, isn't it special that Jesus chose something that people thought was very special to represent himself? He is special. And number two, he chose the one thing in that day that was the most that was the most fragile. The beauty of the wine is that wine lasts a long time. It doesn't go bad very quickly. Bread, real good bread, if you're familiar with really good bread, it gets moldy in a day, especially in the Middle East where it's hot. So that's why in the prayer, our daily bread. Why you had to make bread every day. So in the communion table, Jesus picked one item that was fragile, special, and had to be dealt with every day, and another item, wine, that was extremely stable and was very, very seasonal, indicating that our relationship with the Lord is both very stable and he loves us no matter what, and so it's very unconditional and stable, and at the same time maintaining that relationship is extremely fragile and a daily devotional thing. So those two elements combined in it. And so in another culture, in another day, would he have picked bread? Well, maybe so, maybe not. We don't know. But let's not read into it. The Bible's a real book at a real time, real people, and let's not read into it more than it is. Just appreciate those properties of bread at that time and what it represented spiritually as as an object lesson of our relationship with him.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes. And so as you alluded to, the leavening, right? So most ancient breads we think were unleavened. So it didn't contain yeast or leavening agents. Instead, we think they probably might have used natural fermentation processes or like sourdough starter cultures to make the bread rise just slightly. But the bottom line for this context is using that fermentation process or having the sourdough starter, it would also reduce the the gluten content of the bread. All right. So they already started with grains that had lower gluten content. Then they would either ferment them, use the sourdough culture starter, which would further reduce the gluten content. Over the centuries, as we said, the wheat's undergone significant domestication and breeding in order to improve the yield, to improve disease resistance, and other desirable traits like having higher gluten content. All right. The bottom line for this, though, is that I do not think Jesus would tell us to eat something that would hurt us. All right. I think the bread that they consumed was different back then than our modern bread. As I said, grains had less gluten, and it was likely made using a fermentation process. But I also think, we're going to dive more into this, our environmental exposures are different today than what they're exposed to during the time of Jesus. And that does affect the way your body digests and utilizes glutens. It also affects your susceptibility to gluten intolerance and gluten sensitivity. So for example, they didn't have artificial colors, artificial flavoring, grass chemicals, chemical preservatives, GMOs. They didn't have antibiotics at that point, at least, they had herbals, but they didn't have these patented antibiotics. They also didn't have glyphosate, right? We're going to talk about that too. That's a patented antibiotic. And they didn't have as much exposure to grains and grains derivatives as we do today, right? You and I have talked about this because of the Farm Bill. Grains are ubiquitous in our food supply, in personal care products, in cleaning supplies, like you name it, it's everywhere. And so we just have an overabundance of exposure to grains and grain derivatives. And I do want to point out, this is a common theme in our podcast. This was a man-made problem, right? You're going to see as I get deeper into the connection between grains and diseases, this was largely, in my opinion, a man-made condition. All right, so having said that, let's go to the next question. Question 3, can you tell me more about how grains can cause disease? I think myself, my child, whoever might have issues with grains. The doctors keep saying that I don't. Okay. This is what we see in clinic, right? In clinical studies and in case studies where we can reverse diseases. We see that gluten and grains are the #1 food trigger for all chronic and autoimmune diseases. Okay, like that's not me saying that. This is what we are seeing in clinical practice. As you mentioned, Joel, we just interviewed Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride, who created the GAPS diet. She stated in that interview, which that's going to come out, I think, in a couple of weeks, she stated that she has seen every chronic or autoimmune disease reverse following a GAPS protocol, and a foundational tenet is no grains, right? Aside from that, countless case studies of individuals simply going grain-free have actually healed from numerous diseases. We know, based on the scientific literature, there's over 200 medical conditions that have already been connected to gluten consumption. Meaning, if you remove gluten, all grains, you'll see these conditions start reversing. Some of these include things like asthma, infertility, chronic fatigue, depression, skin rashes, acid reflux, anemia, headaches, ear ringing, dizziness, bone loss, IBS. We also know, as I said, the glutens, and there's a reason I'm saying plural glutens, which we'll get to in a minute. Glutens can contribute to the formation of practically all autoimmune and chronic diseases: Hashimoto's, MS, arthritis, cancer, Crohn's, diabetes, you name it. So how does it actually contribute to the formation of, let's say, neurological conditions? Okay. Gluten is known in the scientific literature to be a neurotoxin, which means it stimulates neuronal antibodies. That means your body makes antibodies against your nerve tissues. That can result in MS, dementia, ADHD, autism, brain fog, you name it. Gluten can also induce high blood sugar levels, right? Talk about diabetes. It can cause vascular damage and inflammation, which could lead to atherosclerosis. It can cause inflammation around the heart, leading to pericarditis, right? The list goes on and on. These are all documented in the scientific literature. Now, some studies have shown that gluten is resistant to complete digestion by the human body, okay? And this is probably because it has a high glutamine and proline content, which we'll get to in a minute. But the bottom line is, when gluten is not fully digested by the gastrointestinal tract, we say it's partially digested, it will end up producing large peptides. So you start as a gluten is a protein. It's a very large peptide. And your body breaks it down. You want it to be broken down into individual amino acids. When you have incomplete digestion, it breaks down into these little peptides, which are just strains of amino acids. Those peptides can actually cross the small intestinal barrier and trigger systemic inflammation. So it can trigger inflammation within the gastrointestinal tract itself, but also systemically throughout the body. And there's been
Sina, are you saying that the incomplete digestion means that you have large peptides rather than extremely small peptides?
So what I'm saying is, you'd start with the gluten in wheat, for instance, is called alpha-gliadin. It is a large peptide. And what happens is it gets digested by pepsin and trypsin, and it gets broken down into 4 or 5 smaller peptides. So you started with alpha-gliadin, a large peptide, your body broke it down into a smaller peptide. And if it doesn't get broken down from those smaller peptides into individual amino acids, you can have harm done to the body and the gastrointestinal tract. So for instance, two of those smaller peptides are what we call zonulin-inducing peptides. Now, zonulin is a naturally produced hormone-like chemical, and it's very important for your immune system because it allows the immune system to go into the interior of the gastrointestinal tract if you have like an imbalance or something. And it does that by like opening up the gates, okay? And it lets these immune cells into the gastrointestinal tract, and that's regulated by zonulin. When gluten is not fully digested, it's broken down into those smaller peptides. The result is too much zonulin gets released. It binds to a receptor. The name isn't important, but it's CXCR3. Causes a cascade of reactions to occur, which ends up disrupting the function of your tight junctions. We call that leaky gut. All right. So too much undigested gluten results in too much zonulin being released or produced, which causes dysregulation of your tight junctions, which can result in leaky gut. Okay, so gluten by itself, if not properly digested, can result in leaky gut on its own. But then we have glyphosate, which exacerbates this condition. So glyphosate, as you know, has been proposed to affect the gut microbiome. It is a patented antibiotic. It disrupts these gut barrier functions, so the leaky gut function, the tight junction functions. It also has been shown to, on its own, induce intestinal permeability, which is leaky gut. And it inhibits our ability to digest gluten. So I want to briefly explain that because that's our topic for today. So we have lining our small intestine, we have peptidases. These are enzymes that can break down those 4 or 5 small gluten peptides that I talked about, those peptides that can be harmful. These peptidases can break that down, and they can break it down to an amino acid level. Now, we know that glyphosate can actually disrupt that process, and it does it by its involvement with DPP4. Okay, that's another major protease or enzyme. So glyphosate decreases the activity of DPP4 enzyme by oxidizing it. That means that enzyme can't digest the gluten peptides as well, or it can't digest them at all in some people's cases, and you end up with those harmful gluten proteins in your GI tract. Okay, so that's one mechanism that has been figured out as to how glyphosate exacerbates the gluten sensitivity and gluten intolerance in individuals. And now that we know that wheat, for instance, is desiccated with glyphosate, right? So it's sprayed with glyphosate just prior to harvest. This has become a deadly combination for people. Again, this is a man-made problem, right? We're applying this synthetic chemical to our food, making the wheat potentially harmful for some people. And sure enough, you can find graphs online, like published in the scientific literature, that show an exponential rise in gluten sensitivity, gluten intolerance that tracks with the exponential rise in glyphosate exposure on our food. All right, so there is, it's not causation, right? We don't have enough data yet to say this is cause and effect. It's a correlation at this point. It's just an association. But we do know that glyphosate does exacerbate the incidence, the number of cases of gluten sensitivity, gluten intolerance, and celiac disease. Can it account for all of the cases? Well, no, because the first documented case of celiac actually occurred in the late 1800s. And this was long before glyphosate was ever invented. It was invented in like 1950 or something. But celiac and gluten sensitivity actually probably go back further than the late 1800s. There's some paleontologists and researchers that have analyzed skeletal remains and historical records. And they have found evidence that celiac disease and gluten intolerance probably did exist in some ancient populations. And there's some ancient texts and historical accounts that have described symptoms that are consistent with celiac disease. So grain seemingly did cause problems for some people, prior to the introduction of glyphosate, the introduction of GMOs, and all these other environmental toxins that we have, it was clearly not a large scale number like we see today. So it is modern practices, right? And modern toxins, modern contamination that have exacerbated the number of cases that we are seeing.
Hi, everybody. To watch the full episode of Beyond Labels, click on the subscription link located in the description box.